set.
No, mine's gonna end up being 10 to 11 minutes. So my printer's
Yeah, the Surface is better for
You can
things
do whatever
like
you want.
this.
Kick
but,
me.
Because you can use a pen.
yeah, I can do it with this too. I figured out how to use a pen with this too, but it
With
isn't,
the iPad.
but it isn't quite as good.
Yeah, not as a 3.
There's a big iPad coming out,
Okay.
size of the Surface.
That was all right. I mean, that 3 is nice. It does everything. But I it's
Smaller, yeah.
like that.
All right, thank you all for attending this faculty panel evaluating the work of Harry Jaffa. This event is sponsored by Pi Sigma Alpha, the Politics Honorary. If you are a politics student and would like to receive more information about joining the honorary, please write your name and email address on the sheet by the door. I'm Jonathan Walker, a third-year doctoral student here at Hillsdale, and I'll be introducing the panelists. In order of presentation, they are Dr. Thomas West, Professor of Politics, Dr. Ronald Pestritto, Graduate Dean and Professor of Politics, Dr. Grant, Assistant Professor of Politics, and Dr. Larry Arnn, 12th President of the college. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, followed by a question and answer period. We will begin with Dr. West.
Thanks, Jonathan. As a former student of Harry Jaffa, the thing I'm most grateful for is his brilliant interpretation of America and his analysis of the problem of the best political order. Jaffa's intellectual point of departure was his encounter with Leo Strauss. And I believe in Jaffa's mind, that was the most important thing that ever happened to him, with the exception of his marriage and family. Strauss taught Jaffa 2 big things. First, political philosophy is possible. Contrary to the almost universal opinion of that day, would have been, say, around 1950, Strauss taught him there is a rational case, to the idea of natural right. That is, the idea that there is such a thing as justice that is true for all human beings at all times. Strauss convinced Jaffa that the best case for natural right is to be found in the classical philosophers, thus Jaffa's lifelong interest in Plato and Aristotle. Second, Strauss convinced Jaffa that the American founding was defective. I'll exaggerate for the sake of clarity by summarizing Strauss in this way. The founding was based on Locke. Locke was a follower of Hobbes. Hobbes followed Machiavelli, and Machiavelli grounded politics on low self-interest. So, Strauss therefore left Jaffa with a problem. If the classics are the standard, and if America was based on a rejection of the classics, is there any way America can be defended? Jaffa's good friend Harry Newman at Claremont used the term pre-Jaffa Jaffa to characterize his scholarship up to 1975. Like other Straussians, Jaffa at first tried to defend America by looking for something in the regime that ennobled its supposedly low beginnings. For example, Harvey Mansfield thought that he had found the ennobling element in the U.S. Constitution, which, in his view, created a constitutional culture that rescued America from the dangerous consequences of the half-truth that all men are created equal. The pre-Jaffa Jaffa also tried to find a nobler America in something outside the Declaration. In Crisis of the House Divided, 1959, Jaffa argued that Lincoln's statesmanship is what transformed Jefferson's Lockean enlightened self-interest into a lofty moral goal. But sometime around 1975, Jaffa, as it were, became Jaffa. His long rethinking of the founding, starting at that time, took place in 3 stages. The first was exemplified by his book, How to Think About the American Revolution, 1978, In that book, various conservative intellectuals, Wilmore Kendall, George Carey, M.E. Bradford, among others, had denied that the founding was based on Lockean natural rights. Martin Diamond had claimed the Declaration of Independence provides almost no guidance regarding the structure of government. Jaffa easily proved both of them wrong, or all of them wrong. More important, he showed how the founding principles of equality and liberty were, if understood as the founders and Lincoln did, conservative principles. Jaffa meant that these principles once were and could again become the basis of a good society. Jaffa's revised approach meant that he no longer needed Lincoln to vindicate America. The founding could be defended in its own terms. More recent conservatives often seem to share the reservations of those with whom Jaffa tangled in the 1970s. In several of the Jaffa obituaries written by conservatives, such as Yuval Levin's and Richard Brookhiser's in National Review, or Harvey Mansfield's at the Weekly Standard, Jaffa's crisis book is highly praised, while his post-75 writings are either not mentioned at all or are passed by with minimal remark. Most conservatives, to say nothing of liberals, have their doubts about the founders' political theory of natural rights. The second stage of Jaffa's reassessment occurred in the Reagan years, when liberal attacks on the family and on the Christian right grew more and more strident. Jaffa became increasingly interested in the fact that the founders were pro-morality, pro-religion, and pro-heterosexual marriage. Some scholars were arguing at that time that the founding was an incoherent amalgam of non-Lockean moral and religious traditions blended together with Lockean natural rights. Jaffa disagreed, arguing that the founders' understanding was perfectly coherent. Without citizen virtue, the founders maintained, government cannot secure the people's natural rights. Some of Jaffa's writings from that period of the 80s appear in his 1984 book, American Conservatism and the American Founding. For conservative intellectuals like Alan Bloom and Robert Bork, the principles of the founding were ultimately destructive of everything good and decent in America. They were a time bomb unwittingly planted by the founders themselves. The radicals of the 60s, Bloom wrote in his 1987 bestseller, Closing of the American Mind, absolutized and radicalized the ideas of equality and freedom that were inherent in our regime. Jaffa was able to refute this claim because he had rediscovered the moral dimension of the natural rights doctrine. The third and final stage of Jaffa's understanding was reached in the late 80s. In an essay published in 1987 in Interpretation magazine, that not only is the founding defensible, not only is it moral, but now it is the founding itself, which is the standard of noble politics in the modern world. The full expression of this mature understanding of America, Jaffa's mature understanding of America, and not merely of Lincoln, appears in what I regard as his most insightful book, A New Birth of Freedom, 2000. Far from being opposed to the classical understanding of politics, the American regime is required by it in the condition of the modern world. Jaffa argued that the classical political teaching of Aristotle had to be modified after the rise of Christianity because the new religion had severed the old connection between the political community and its gods. In a world dominated by a universalistic religion, said Jaffa, a new ground for political obligation had to be found that was not tied to religious authority. That was the law of nature and of nature's God. The founders' doctrine of toleration eliminates salvation of the soul as an end of politics. Paradoxically, political life is thereby elevated by removing from it a leading source of its degradation, namely persecution, arising from the conviction of one's own sanctity. The founders' doctrine also elevates politics by announcing a sacred cause, the cause of liberty, which elicits the noble virtues of statesmanship and citizenship. The social compact theory challenges men to live up to its moral demands, which require concern for others, respecting their rights, and self-restraint, the virtues of parents and citizens. Those who complain that the founders reduced life to mere self-preservation neglect, in Jaffa's view, what the founders actually said. The purpose of politics, as the Declaration proclaims, is safety and happiness. These, as Jaffa writes in New Birth, are the alpha and omega of political life. That is, liberty and property come to sight as means to the preservation of life, but their enduring worth is in the service not of mere life, but of the good or happy life. It is the natural order of these wants, directed towards their corresponding natural ends, Jaffa writes, that constitute the architectonic principles of a society arising out of compact, properly understood. Here Jaffa brings the political theory of the founding back around to the classical concern with philosophy as the best life. The soul of a true American has a higher destiny than mere preservation or acquisition, although there is a place in America for those too. So far I've really summarized Jaffa's work. I would add that in my view, Jaffa could have made his argument more convincing if he had lavished on Locke the same revisionist assiduity and insight that he gave to Lincoln and the founders. But Jaffa left the task of reassessing Locke to others. Michael Zuckert correctly identified this lacuna in his book, The Truth About Leo Strauss, and he wondered why Jaffa had never addressed it. My own response to Zuckert's challenge is this. Strauss grossly distorted Locke for justifiable pedagogical reasons in several widely known anti-Lockean statements. Strauss's ultimate assessment of Locke was much more sympathetic. For example, Chapter 8 of What is Political Philosophy and Chapter 2 of Liberalism. Locke was not an Aristotelian, but his thought was far more attentive to the moral and religious prerequisites of constitutionalism than one would gather from a superficial reading of Strauss. I have discussed these points in various publications, so there's no need for me to say anything more here. Jaffa's post-1975 writings provide a wonderful point of entry into the American mind as it was shaped by the founders' political thought. And although it is far from perfect, I still regard Jaffa's New Birth of Freedom as the best book ever written on America. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Jonathan, for organizing this event. I am going to focus on a particular area of Dr. Jaffa's work that I'm most personally familiar with to try to give the students here some understanding or example of why his work would have been important to students such as themselves of American politics and political thought. And my remarks may be a little different than others here, and perhaps a little different from most that have been published since his death, since I think I'm in the minority that did not come to know Jaffa primarily through his work on Lincoln. Of course, I came to know that work and admire it greatly, but that was not really my introduction to Jaffa, nor was it the thing that most drew my attention to him at first. So most students of Jaffa came to Claremont because of his fame for this work on Lincoln, whereas I, by contrast, simply lucked out. I didn't start off as a graduate student at Claremont. I was an undergraduate at Claremont McKenna College. And I had no idea who Harry Jaffa was, that he was even in Claremont, that many people came there specifically to study with him at the graduate level. I was studying economics and the practical aspects of government at first. I then came to know Charles Kessler, who became my principal teacher, and many here will know that name today Kessler is the editor of the Claremont Review of Books. He's the editor of one of the most widely used editions of the Federalist Papers. But when I was an undergraduate, Kessler was making a name for himself in academic circles, and was doing so by speaking to the vital role of the natural law in American politics and American political thought. And I came to know this through Kessler, but then discovered that this focus was largely influenced by Harry Jaffa. In fact, Kessler had published a few years prior to that, while still a college student, a feature essay in National Review on Jaffa's account of the Declaration of Independence and how that was the key to understanding the first principles of the American regime. And I recommend that piece. It's still very useful. It's called The Special Meaning of the Declaration, published back in NR. And so I became interested in these questions because of Kessler's work, and then it was simply my good fortune to learn that, you know, the man himself, Dr. Jaffa, was just down the hall. So I don't quite go back to the ancient times with Dr. Jaffa after the fashion of certain of my co-panelists, but I did have the great fortune to catch him right at the end of his formal teaching career. I remember, in fact, the speech that he gave at his retirement dinner. But luckily for me and for many others who came to Claremont after me, Dr. Jaffa not only continued as a productive scholar for decades, but also continued to teach, sometimes formally, more often informally. This was not the case of somebody who retired because he wanted to flee or escape from students and get down to serious work. No, quite to the contrary. He would hold forth for hours at a time when you came to see him in his office, which we were regularly invited to do. So as a kind of generic, I guess a generic policy conservative, for lack of a better term, in my undergraduate days, one of the first things that fascinated me about Jaffa were his disputes with some of the icons of the conservative movement. It had really never occurred to me that there might be principal differences among conservatives. And here I am at Hillsdale College some years later. Or that these conservatives might share the same policy goals, might support the same political candidates, while diverging greatly on far deeper and more fundamental matters. So I came to know Jaffa right around the time of Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court. And while it's often forgotten that Jaffa actually supported that nomination, his subsequent attacks on Bork and on others who shared Bork's philosophy, William Rehnquist, Antonin Scalia, Edwin Meese, to name a few, this earned him much infamy in conservative circles. So what was the problem with these conservative legal icons especially? Well, like Jaffa and nearly all conservatives, the conservative legal establishment was bitterly opposed to the liberal judicial activism that had dominated American jurisprudence since the Warren Court. And at the heart of liberal judicial activism was a dedication to the so-called living Constitution, right? To the idea that there were no permanent principles to the Constitution, that it had to be interpreted by judges to fit ever-evolving norms of new periods in history. So the conservative legal establishment called on these liberal judges to remove themselves from this role, to stop legislating from the bench, as the saying went, and to defer instead to the will of the people as it was expressed through their legislature and through their executive. And Jaffa agreed with the criticism of liberal judicial activism, but he pointed out that the conservative case against it was just as relativistic and just as contrary to the actual political theory of the American founding as was that of the liberals. Rehnquist, for instance, wanted to replace the living Constitution approach of liberal jurist William Brennan with the living Constitution approach of progressives like Oliver Wendell Holmes, whose attack on natural law Rehnquist cited and relied upon in his call for courts to defer to legislative majorities. And Scalia came in for similar criticism when in 1996, Scalia emphatically rejected the idea a central idea to the American founders, that universal moral principles could serve as a boundary of sorts for democratic rule. Scalia had written, quote, "The whole theory of democracy is that the majority rules. You protect minorities only because the majority determines that there are certain minority positions that deserve protection. You cannot have democratic theory and then say, but what about the minority? The minority loses, except to the extent that the majority in its document of government has agreed to accord the minority rights." End quote. Now, I shouldn't have to explain to anyone in this audience how often Justice Scalia must have slept through any class he might have had on the Federalist or anything else having to do with the American founding. And Jaffa took him to task for it in an article titled, "Antonin Scalia, Meet James Madison and Friends," one of my favorites. For me, however, this is really how Jaffa brought me to Lincoln. For, of course, Jaffa's own effort during the days that I was a student to reacquaint the conservative legal establishment with the actual principles of American constitutionalism mirrored Lincoln's effort to reacquaint Stephen Douglas with the very same thing. Douglas had contended that the regime ought to be indifferent as to whether slavery was voted up or down, that as long as the majority got to decide, that's what our principles required. And for Lincoln, of course, this was not an application of our fundamental principles, but was instead a repudiation of them. And this was among the many issues that Jaffa brought out in his landmark work, Crisis of the House Divided. And that's a work, I would say, for students here, if you want an example of how to make your own writing really strong, if you want a model for how to make your argument stronger by giving the best case for the opposing view, Crisis, I think, is the book to study. Because nobody makes, I think, a fairer or more compelling case for Douglas than Jaffa does in that book, before he refutes it with Lincoln. Now, we're supposed to consider some criticisms of Dr. Jaffa, at least according to the advertisement for this panel. And of course, it's often said that Dr. Jaffa was a cantankerous man, that he seemed to save his harshest criticism and his sharpest polemics for his friends, or those who would be his former friends. And it's true that I myself always cringed when I sent him something that I had written, half expecting to hear back from him that I had betrayed both him and the Republic. Fortunately, I was spared this, I think probably because he had more important targets than me to occupy his attention. So one can certainly question the prudence of the many fights that he picked with fellow conservatives and Straussians. But I think it's fair to say that Jaffa's motives in these debates were those he understood Lincoln to have. Jaffa was a patriot, and the very principles of the regime were at stake, he believed. And he believed that those principles were not properly understood, as they needed to be by those who really should have known better. Jaffa always mentioned Aristotle's admonition that truth is superior to friendship. That said, I'll close with the observation that Dr. Jaffa was always extremely kind and generous to me and my family. In fact, he took a personal interest in not only my family, but in the family lives of his students. And I think that's because he believed very strongly in the connection between the moral and the intellectual virtues. That, at least, is what I took out of that, in addition to the many purely intellectual gifts that he handed down. So I'm of course, very grateful for that, and I will close. Thank you.
I'm going to sit when you're my size. Lecterns are, you're so far away. Failing eyes and far away, so I'm going to sit and deliver my remarks. I'm going to talk about Jaffa's view of the natural law and how that developed over time as a model of how one should approach the study of the natural law. And I'll say something about his relationship with his teacher, Leo Strauss, in regards to that, too. Reading the obituaries about Jaffa are revealing in this slide, almost no one takes any cognizance of the fact that he, I think, was principally a student of political philosophy and not merely a conservative intellectual making polemical arguments. He was a polemicist by nature and very good at that, but there's a great deal of substance to his writings beyond being a conservative icon. And so if you look at the rather snarky and superficial review, say, of obituary given by Richard Brookhiser in National Review, it's mostly about Jaffa's personal foibles, with the obligatory mention, Crisis of the House Divided was a great book because it was written in 1959 and it was uncontroversial except in scholarly circles, and Jaffa hadn't broken with other conservatives at the time. Or the liberals, so nobody talks about his natural, that I can find in the eulogies of Jaffa, his obituaries, his natural law doctrine, which was central to his scholarly endeavors from his first book, Thomism and Aristotelianism, on. So from 1952 till he died, I mean, he was, well, at least the last several years, he was interested in that. The liberals know that, and there's a lively, to put it one way, obituary of Jaffa in Slate, radiating hate because they understood the importance of his natural law doctrine meant there are things you can't do. So Jaffa was a long time opponent of gay rights. And they get, oh, that natural law thing was important to Jaffa. The conservatives don't seem to be picking up on that so much. So Jaffa wrote this book, which is still very much worthy of reading, Thomism and Aristotelianism. It started out as his doctoral dissertation and became a book, was published in 1952. It's worth reading. I'm going to criticize it in light of his later, I believe, more superior understanding, which is generally less well received by scholars. They don't take it as seriously. So you have this disjunction, I think, between the substance and the scholarly reception. Thomism and Aristotelianism was the comparison of the natural right teaching of Aristotle with the natural law doctrine of Thomas Aquinas, where Jaffa criticized, following some remarks of Strauss, the conflation of reason and revelation, the alleged conflation of reason and revelation in the Thomistic natural law doctrine. I think Jaffa gets some things wrong in that first book, which he later modified due to a better understanding of how to approach the serious study of political philosophy and politics. And specifically, what Jaffa doesn't do in this early work is he doesn't appreciate the importance of historical context or relate it as it relates to the specific theological political situations in which Aristotle and Thomas wrote. And he also manifests no real interest in the question or the pursuing the inquiry into the nature of God, or answering the question, Strauss had this phrase taken from Cicero, quid sit Deus, what is God? Jaffa doesn't show any interest in those questions in that work. And of course, any natural law doctrine, that's the fundamental concern, is what is God and how does he relate as the lawgiver to that doctrine. So this is a grave defect. Jaffa's later work, though, especially his books on Lincoln and a number of shorter pieces, demonstrated a more robust awareness of the key philosophic questions in the same vein as his teacher Leo Strauss's treatments of the idea of the natural law. In these later works, Jaffa does address the importance of the historical context for understanding the theological political problem, and hence the meaning of the text under consideration. And the question, quid sit Deus, has a much greater prominence in his later writings. In Thomism and Aristotelianism, Jaffa is concerned with two things: a critique of contemporary positivistic and relativistic social science on the one hand, a concern he shared with his teacher, Professor Strauss, and what Jaffa takes to be the conflation of reason and revelation in Thomism on the other. In these concerns, Jaffa was certainly taking his bearings from the work of his teacher, but Jaffa did not, at least in this early work, adopt Strauss's full perspective on Thomas or on how one should read text or properly understand the nature of political philosophy. He starts from some remarks that Strauss makes about Thomas in some well-known passages in a book which some of you might have encountered called Natural Right and History. But he doesn't notice that the phrasing of those remarks. He takes things that Strauss says are assumptions in the writing, that we assume this and we assume that, and takes them to be true. Which once, when you see something like, if somebody tells you they assume something, you want to say, wait a second, maybe that's not right. So in other words, Strauss's tentative criticisms of Thomas were taken by Professor Jaffa very, very literally. So he had a rather superficial understanding of how you approach these things. So Jaffa follows and expands on Strauss's criticism of Thomas on these points. He maintains, with Strauss apparently in Natural Right and History, that Thomas confuses reason and revelation, especially regarding what we would call the conscience or synderesis, and the natural and supernatural ends of man. Jaffa also argues that the Thomistic natural law is inflexible when compared to Aristotelian natural right, another point Strauss had alleged in that brief passage in Natural Right and History. Those are, we'll see, I think, are superficial considerations that further study of those issues reveal to be not genuine concerns. Jaffa did follow Strauss on some more serious points. First, Jaffa saw that the contemporary followers of Thomas failed to relate Thomas's thought to the two issues of utmost importance in his day and ours, the conceptions of science and history which dominate recent thought. And Jaffa, to his credit, treated Aristotle and Thomas as if these are authors who could be telling you the truth. They could be teaching you about key issues that you need to understand. We can't dismiss them in light of doctrines of modern relativism and historicism. So Jaffa was, once again to his credit, trying to confront the dominant thoughts of his time and move beyond those thoughts to see if he could wrestle with these fundamental problems. Jaffa was seeking to understand Aristotle and Thomas as they understood themselves. But I would argue his effort would have borne more fruit had he also sought to grasp the historical context necessary to grappling with the theological political problem in general and the question, what is God, in particular. So, in other words, the early Jaffa didn't actually follow Strauss, although he thought he was doing so, because Strauss took those things very seriously. He, contrary to what some of Strauss's critics argue, maintained you have to understand the historical context to properly appreciate the works of the authors you're seeking to understand. Talks about this in a number of essays. I'll give you one example. Maimonides' statement on political science in the book What is Political Philosophy would be one. Strauss modeled this type of scholarship in works like Spinoza's Critique of Religion, one of his earliest books, where he spent a great deal of time studying the theological and political context in which Spinoza wrote. The young Professor Jaffa, on the other hand, did not take account of the theological political context in his book Thomism and Aristotelianism. In other words, he simply compared the pertinent text of Aristotle and Thomas without taking into account the difference between the polytheistic, post-sophistic Enlightenment world inhabited by Aristotle and the medieval world dominated by the idea of the biblical God. The older Jaffa takes the historical, political, theological context much more seriously, thus making it possible to comprehend fully the Aristotelian dictum that all natural right is changeable. To put it simply, the young Professor Jaffa did not ask himself if Aristotle would have written the Ethics in the same way if he was writing in the 13th century AD. Now, it's reasonable to say, why do we care about the historical context if you're looking at simply an ideal like the natural law? The historical context and the relation of that context to the theological political situation of a given time is absolutely essential to the possibility of a natural law doctrine. The advent of monotheism in a cosmopolitan political context made a cogent natural law doctrine possible. So you'll often hear correctly that authors such as Plato and Aristotle had a natural right doctrine and not a natural law doctrine, and that's because there was no divine lawgiver enforcing that natural right. To put this very simply, it's a very complicated thing. Professor Jaffa, in Thomism and Aristotelianism, evidenced no interest in the relation between natural right and natural law when seen in the light of the radically altered theological political situation of Thomas's day. The young Professor Jaffa also showed little concern for the question, what is God, in his early work. Jaffa was aware that the Thomistic natural law doctrine requires a divine lawgiver, but he does not investigate what kind of deity would be required for the existence of a coherent natural law teaching. A neglect of the theological political context led Jaffa to fail to see the full meaning of the Aristotelian teaching that all natural right is changeable. In other words, what is right by nature will have a different look in different contexts. The later Professor Jaffa altered his approach. I don't think due to a deepened study of Strauss's works. I haven't seen any evidence of that in Jaffa's. He actually didn't spend much time reading Strauss, I don't think. As many students of Strauss don't actually spend much time seriously studying the works of Strauss. I'd talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested, but in that nerdy topic. But however he came to this appreciation, he did. In Jaffa's mature work, the idea that natural right is changeable is linked to the theological political problem explicitly, particularly in Chapter 2 of his magnum opus, A New Birth of Freedom, where Jaffa provides us with a fascinating examination of the theological political history of the West through a discussion of authors such as Dante and Shakespeare as a necessary background to elucidating the meaning of the social compact theory of the American founding. The whole chapter is an extended analysis of the relation between natural right and theological political context. Jaffa's late work also manifests his deep concern with the question, what is God? A concern not evident in his early work. Jaffa's arguments in essays such as Leo Strauss, The Bible and Political Philosophy about the biblical God and how revelation and reason both disagree and agree are profound. I'd also mention Jaffa's thought experiment in a short essay you can find online, Who Owns the Copyright to the Universe?, about the possibility of a contemporary natural right doctrine that depends neither on modern science or monotheism is another example of a deep engagement with the theological political problem. I'm going to end there because I'm out of time.
All right.
Poor Professor West and I, we like the height, even Tom, of John Grant and the youth of Professor Pestritto. All we have is seniority and stature. We have Professor Jaffa's papers here. I think they're all here now. The books are coming. I think they may have come too, but most of them are here for sure. And that seems right for the same reason that it seemed right to me to come to work at this college 15 years ago. The college was founded by some people who thought that civil and religious freedom were inestimable blessings and that sound learning was their necessary support. And those are actually the themes of the life of Harry Jaffa. I'm going to explain that a little bit and tell you what it was like to be his student. You will see that that was not always an easy thing to be. The first time I met him was in August of 1974. I was done the great honor by Peter Schramm, a friend of mine now since that day, that year, to go pick up Professor Jaffa for class. And we knocked on his front door, and in we go, and he appeared in he was wearing a white shirt, cream-colored boxer shorts, and black socks. So I meet the great man that I've given up law school to go and study with and wonder, what have I done? And it emerged by the time we got to the class, driving 4 or 5 blocks, but him going away to get dressed, that he couldn't remember who I was, and he couldn't remember what the class was about. And this was his way as a teacher. He was often disorganized. I hasten to say that this was relieved by many classes, where you would come outside and they should have been over an hour or an hour and a half earlier, and it was dark outside and everyone had forgotten the time. And these were not planned, these classes. They were driven by his genius. And when it seized him, it seized us. And it happened a lot, although not every time. I can remember the first thing he said in the first class. I can remember it all almost verbatim. He got down to studying. He actually had asked Peter on the way what the class was about, but he asked it again in class, probably just for effect, so we would all know that we weren't important enough for him to focus on, maybe. But what it was about was the Nicomachean Ethics, his favorite book. And he held up the book and he said, "So we're going to read this book," he said. And when people get to be old men like me, I'm older than that now myself, he said, we start making a list of the 100 greatest books. But life, any human life, is too short to read 100 books, if they're great. I have a list, he said, of the 3 greatest books. What follows is a little cryptic, but he said, Aristotle's Politics would require some translation to be fully relevant to the modern world. Maybe he was excluding that. The Bible, he said, is in a category of its own. Maybe he was excluding that. He said, Plato's Republic would have to be on any such list. He said the word Shakespeare, and that hung there for a while, and he said, Socrates said that a poet would arise that could write both tragedy and comedy. And then he held up the Ethics again, and he said, this is a perfect book, and we are going to read this book. We never got out of book 1. We skipped the part about arguing with Plato because a semester was not long enough to go into all that. We read the first line for 2 weeks. What did I learn from that? First of all, I was just beginning to put together the jigsaw puzzle that one must to call himself learned. I learned that, yes, I had come to the right place because there are some things that are so precious that all of life is worth them. They're worth all of life. And you must devote yourself to those things. And you have to remember in Jaffa's many political battles that he fought them in the name of some things that are transcendent. And he thought that politics were defensible when they protected those things. Professor Jaffa introduced me to Winston Churchill and then to Martin Gilbert, my other great teacher in life, and they both died in the last month. And because he introduced me to Winston Churchill and then Martin Gilbert, he introduced me to Penelope, my wife, a thing for which he took credit for the rest of his life, and also for the quality of my children. Martin Gilbert, a more gentle man than Harry Jaffa, also took credit for my wife, but not for my children. That credit actually belongs to Penny. Jaffa cared about statesmanship. He taught that it was the place where ultimate things lived amidst circumstances. He thought that the statesman was the guardian of the wise, and he thought that they were fundamentally important human types, and they were rare, and Churchill represented such a thing. So I studied with the man who knows the most in the world about Winston Churchill. I personally know much more about Winston Churchill than Harry Jaffa could possibly have known, in one sense, but of course, in another sense, not as much. He didn't write much about Churchill, but what he wrote is simply beautiful. And I, in my 40 years of working on it, come to understand it lately, if at all. I was there in 1976 when Harry Jaffa first took out after the conservatives. We would ride bikes. I rode a bicycle 20,000 miles just so I could be around him and pepper him with questions and get him to tell us the things that you might have thought he would come organized to class to tell us. But they were the kind of things that he knew and very few people have ever known. And I would go and sit with him, and he would read me bits. He told me later in an interview that I did, and these gentlemen have talked about all this beautifully. Tom West's piece about it is the best single summary of the work of Harry Jaffa that I've read. I read it now. I haven't read the other two. And what he did was, he told me that he had taken his account of the American founding from his friends who were students of Strauss, and he had not looked at it. He'd come at it through Lincoln, and he'd figured out things about Lincoln. And then, just like John Grant, he explains about his book, Thomism and Aristotelianism, he decided that he had not taken seriously enough Lincoln's teaching when he began to read about George Washington, about the founding of America. It couldn't be low and solid. Not if its heroes were what they were. Not if they defended the things that they defended in the language of the Declaration of Independence, and he had thought very much that they could be. And I just want to describe what it was like, because he has a habit that I have. He would jiggle his leg when he sat, when he was excited, and he would sit and read to me what he'd written that day, and this thing got to be over 150 pages long, an APSA paper. And Irving Kristol was to be the chairman of the panel, and he was after Kristol. And I met Martin Diamond only once in my life, and that was outside that panel, and shook his hand and said that I'd read some of his work and was proud to meet him. And in we go, and 400 people went in that room, and Martin Diamond didn't come. And probably wise not to come. Professor Jaffa was at his very best that day. He was virile and strong, and he was riding a bicycle 150 miles a week, and he would just leap to the podium to answer the questions. And that was a great gestation in his life. And the effects of it are everywhere now, because back in the day, you wouldn't hear from the conservative movement much talk about America. Today, it's all about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and there are parts that don't like those things, but everybody figures that those are forces to reckon with. And I think he has to do with that. And his students do. And my last story is about what it's like to be around him. I was one of the founders of the Claremont Institute, along with Tom West and a few other people, and soon enough I became its president. I'm a bit younger than some of them, so that was kind of a shift. And that placed me in a particular station as regards Professor Jaffa. I'll put it in terms he liked. I was like the Jews. I became a chosen person. And just like for the Jews, that's not all good news. And I did that for 15 years, and I was in constant contact with him during those 15 years. He had my home number, as everybody else did and does today. And he was always calling, and he was always telling me what to do. And we started down that road a few times that you go down with him, where he attacks something. He sends you a little note and attacks something you wrote, and then he sends you another note and says you haven't answered the first note. And then when you answer the first note or the second note, then you know it's all going to start. And I have all those letters now. That happened 3 or 4 times, and I answered him each time. In different language. My answers are all the same. I'd say, in fact, Professor Jaffa, I agree with you. But it just so happens that prudence is a virtue that you've taught me about, and I am in a position of responsibility to make choices about these things, and I am going to make them. And my teachers have taught me not to cower. And so he would call me up and say, that was good. And then it would be over. I never got to the end of that road, as so many did. A significant time came when he took out after Ed Meese, who happens to be a friend of mine. And Ed Meese had written something about the Declaration of Independence that was very fine, a speech he gave, and then he'd given another speech that wasn't so fine on the subject, and Professor Jaffa decided the two could not be reconciled. And so he published that, and he was rude to Ed Meese in ways that he was very capable of being. And Ed's wife sat down with me at a conference one time and said, Harry Jaffa is a bad man. And I said, and then as I was answering that question, Ed Meese sat down, and he's a friend of mine then and now, much admired. And I said, no, ma'am, he's not. He's just a different kind of fellow than your husband, and they don't understand each other. Your husband should write him an answer. Professor Jaffa decided to compel me to write an introduction to one of those attacks on Ed Meese, which I published, and you can read the introduction. It's published. And Professor Jaffa didn't like it. It wasn't hard enough. It wasn't right. And he got all wound up, and he was rolling, and he talked. After I had him on the speakerphone, and I was working in my office, and he rolled on, and I started timing it. It went on for over 40 minutes. And unlike him, he said, damn it, twice in the course of it. And he finally wound down, and I said, have you finished? And he said, yes, I have. And I said, Well, I'll just reply, you have called me up and cursed at me, which you don't usually do, and you've said that I have to do something, and I reply that I do not. And I hung up the phone. And he called that night, and he said, Larry? His voice was always that, but those were the tones, Larry? And I said, Professor. I've never called him Harry, by the way. And he said, this is the Queen calling. And I said, the Queen? He said, yes, and you're the Prime Minister. You have to listen to the Queen, although you get to do what you want. And I said, what does the Queen have for me tonight? And I listened for a long time. These two teachers of mine are so different, and what do they have in common? Their deaths had led me to think that through anew, and I discovered something I hadn't seen before the other day. On his website, late in his life, Martin Gilbert wrote that he had lived his life in the belief that the things that happened in the past were fixed and unchangeable, and that with the right energy one could find out about them. And this is like a favorite quote of Professor Jaffa's from Thomas Aquinas and from Aristotle. They both said it, as they both said so many things. This alone is denied even to God, to make what has been not to have been. Two men in their different ways who stood up for the truth and for freedom with love and lifelong persistence.
Panelists will now take questions. Just wait for the microphone to get to you. You can direct your question to any individual panelist or to the whole panel, and then it's open to all the panelists if they choose to answer.
This is a question for the most ancient of those who are on the panel.
Larry?
Tom West.
Oh.
And maybe for John Grant. You said, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I don't, two things that people here might find incompatible with one another. And I think I know how they can be made compatible, but others here might want to hear that from one or both of you. That is that justice is eternal, and second, that justice is changeable. That's to say that natural right, what is naturally right, is changeable. How can both of those claims be justified?
Well, I'll answer first and then let John Grant do what he can, but
He represents modernity, you represent antiquity.
thank you so much.
So John's answer is it never was true.
But look, first of all, I didn't say that. I'm not going to own it. Aristotle did say it, and I believe one could defend that. But what I would say, and what I think Aristotle was getting at, is that although what the human good is always the same, the form in which that appears at a particular time and place is going to change depending on circumstances. And so there may be a time and a place when a teaching like Aristotle's is the best form that the natural right teaching should take, and there may be a time and a place for something different from that. Jaffa was famous for making the argument that under the conditions of monotheism and universal, a God who is the God of the whole world, you've got to have some kind of a foundation for political obligation that goes beyond the gods of the city. It's just, we don't believe in gods of the city. We believe in God in our world. And so there needs to be a general rule that is much more explicit and forcefully stated than in the world of Aristotle, when people took for granted the idea that each city had its own god supporting the city's laws. personally would prefer not to formulate things in that way. What I said in my talk was there's one standard. That's what Strauss taught Jaffa, one standard for all time. But what one says in one time or another time may differ based on circumstances in order to achieve and live up to that one standard as best possible. John?
The only thing I would add is Strauss's distinction between the teaching and the intention might be illuminating there. Going back to what you were just saying about how you present things at a certain time, be the teaching and the intention is always the same.
Could I press one issue? The claim that all men are created equal. Was that a claim that Aristotle would have endorsed?
Oh, okay, yeah. The claim that all men are created equal means something very definite and specific in the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't mean we're all equally intelligent, equally virtuous, equally beautiful, equally old. But it means that with respect to political authority, no one has the right to rule another without his consent, with a few exceptions for people maybe who are mentally disabled or something, but normally no. So what one could say about that is that the teaching that all men are created equal, which appears in the founding, American founding, takes for granted that in some very important ways men are created unequal. I would say with Aristotle it's the other way around. In Aristotle's time, the great question, the great problem that he faced, I believe, was this attack of the sophistic Enlightenment on political authority as such. Basically, the idea that political authority should be obeyed was under attack. Think of Thrasymachus in Republic Book 1, this cynical view that justice is the advantage of whoever's in power, and therefore there's no real obligation. So one could say that what was important for Aristotle to do was to make the case for submission to political authority, to make the case, as it were, maybe even overemphasizing the extent to which natural differences justify political rule, or the extent to which the city is natural. Aristotle says the city is natural, and then you start getting into it and you realize he doesn't mean natural in the way we might ordinarily think. It doesn't just spring up spontaneously. It has to be founded, he says. And so, Aristotle's defense of slavery. Yes, he defends it, but then you get into it and you realize what he's saying is that there are some people who are so incredibly stupid they have to be ruled without their consent. They're basically mentally disabled. So I might put it paradoxically and say that the esoteric teaching of Aristotle is all men are created equal. The exoteric teaching is all men are created unequal.
Winston Churchill said many times, in many contexts, that what you do is governed entirely by circumstances. And he said many times in many contexts that there are some things you can never do. And isn't that your problem, Paul? Like it's wrong to kill. What can justify it? Circumstances. Yet it's still wrong to kill.
Yeah, although I think I'm going to press this since no one else is asking questions. I will. Why not? I wonder about Aristotle. The question that one would have to ask is when he discusses natural slavery. The question one would have to ask is, in his view, what proportion of human beings are naturally slaves?
Few.
I'm not sure of that.
No.
The readers of Aristotle, the Arabs, argue the difference between man and man, they think they get this out of Aristotle. The difference between man and man is greater than the difference between man as such and the animals.
Yeah.
And by the way, you know who else says that? John Locke, in his essay on human understanding. And yet he's the great teacher that all men are created equal.
Right.
So
now,
the fact is,
Aristotle would not say all men are created equal.
No, I didn't
There's
say
no
Aristotle
created.
would. No, I said that Locke said that.
Yeah.
Agreeing with the Arab view of Aristotle. Okay, but look, let's talk about Jaffa for a second. He wrote an article on Aristotle in the Strauss-Cropsey, History Political Philosophy, in which he made the argument that Aristotle's teaching on natural slavery is really a teaching that proves that there's a very small number of human beings that are actually natural slaves. Most people aren't. And he supported that argument. Jaffa supported that interpretation of Aristotle in part by pointing to a passage in Book 7 of the Ethic of the Politics of Aristotle, in which Aristotle said that slaves ought to have the prospect of freedom held out to them, implying that actual slavery as it existed in the Greek world was mostly conventional slavery and not justifiable slavery, except because of the force of circumstances. So I think one could say, I'll just stick up for Jaffa's view at this point and leave it at that.
And I'll add to that I talked to Jaffa about this many times, and his opinion was that Aristotle implies in Book 1 of the Politics that if you had technology, if the shuttle could weave and the plectrum strike of itself, then you wouldn't have to have the relation of master and slave. And Jaffa...
That's quite right.
What?
I don't think that's quite right. If slaves...
Do we have any other questions, by the way? I mean, it's a fascinating discussion, but it is supposed to be a Q&A. But.
Dr. Arnn mentioned that Jaffa mentioned that Shakespeare was the poet who could write both comedy and tragedy. And I'm wondering if any of you could speak on Churchill and Shakespeare, sorry, not Churchill, Jaffa and Shakespeare, and maybe starting with you, Dr. West, since you have written on that, but any of you.
I mean, Jaffa has a number of excellent essays, two of which are published in a book edited by Professor West, one on Measure for Measure, one which is especially noteworthy because it's sort of a history of Western civilization through the plays of Shakespeare, and I can't remember the title. I don't know if you do, Tom.
The Shakespearean Universe?
The Shakespearean Universe, yes. So that's very good. And he's also got a speech he gave here at Hillsdale College, which is in 1974, which is available online, on Macbeth, the moral conundrum in Macbeth in relation to especially Camus' portrayal of a similar phenomenon in The Stranger and Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, which is very much worthwhile. So he had tried to apply Shakespeare to moral and political questions. He also has an essay in the Bloom book, Shakespeare's Politics, on King Lear, which I don't think is as good as the others, but that's for what that's worth.
Ooh, heresy. So I had two classes with Professor Jaffa on Shakespeare. And they were both, we read many of the plays, maybe a half a dozen. King Lear was one of them, Macbeth. And he would find a good recording, back in those days, there was actually a hand-cranked, and
Flintstones,
and he would play, and he would pick up the needle, and he would talk. I've heard Professor Jaffa say many times that he's as proud of what he wrote about Shakespeare as anything. I've heard him say several times that his great recognition of his limits was when he decided that he couldn't write a book or a long essay about Huck Finn. It's like a commentary on the Odyssey, he said. It's too great. He loved the thing he wrote about Tom Sawyer. He loved the fact that he studied literature at Yale. And he saw literature, the best literature, great literature, as a way to make a microcosm and an image of the world that you could study and make things plain. And he thought that that was central to the study of the good, including the good and especially the good as it appears in politics. And Professor Jaffa wouldn't shut up about that. And nobody wanted him to. He was at his best when he talked about that.
We're past 5 right now, so if you need to go somewhere, feel free, but we'll continue with questions for a little bit longer.
All of you, or most of you, have mentioned that, I'm over here, that Professor Jaffa had a sort of conflict with the conservative establishment of the time which I think is hard for a lot of us to understand because at least the younger parts of the audience, some of us grew up hearing about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the founding and how great it was. So I was wondering if any of you could comment on that, please.
RJP?
So you grew up always hearing how great the Declaration and the Constitution was. I think one of the most interesting developments about the Tea Party movement, for instance, is there's conservatism, or at least where the energy seems to be in the conservative movement right now, is about those things you mentioned. The reason I think that's interesting is even relatively recently that has not been the case. There's a great deal of ambivalence on the right with interpretations of the founding, with the role of the Declaration, the relationship to the Declaration, the Constitution, the importance of natural rights. And these are all highly contentious things, and were when I was in school and afterwards. And we were out for Dr. Jaffa's funeral, and we were remarking to one another that in a way, sort of the conservative movement has finally come around, to focusing on the things that Jaffa thought were important, that sort of seem to be much more appreciated now than they were at the time that he was engaging in all of his back and forth with his interlocutors within the movement.
But let me add to that I think that you're talking about more recent developments,
Yeah.
but going back to the 70s and earlier, the conservative movement post-World War II, I think, was dominated by Russell Kirk more than anybody else. And Kirk took the position that the founders' doctrine of natural rights is dangerous and destructive. And in fact, Kirk argued that the founders didn't actually believe in natural rights. It was Jefferson who did, and he argued that most of the other founders were much more in the spirit of Edmund Burke, who, in Kirk's telling, was not a natural rights man. And so conservatism, insofar as it was shaped by Kirk, began to define itself as a movement that repudiated the natural rights doctrine of the founding, and was based on a conception of prudence that was detached from any abstract universal principle. And that view of things it was a guy like, say, Irving Kristol was attracted by that view of things, in part because Kristol, as a young man, had been a Marxist. And that is to say, Kristol had been taught, in effect, that if you believe in reason, you have to be a Marxist. And so Kristol very much gravitated to the Kirkian, Burkean type view that in order to be conservative, you need to repudiate reason. You need to be thinking in terms of tradition, custom, that which is old and prescriptive. The reason why Jaffa rebelled against that whole way of understanding conservatism, was that Jaffa thought, that doesn't give you, that way of thinking, that Kirkian way of thinking, doesn't give you a firm grounding, doesn't give you a firm basis on which to criticize Marxism or socialism or any of the other isms that are coming along. That's why Jaffa was interested in the idea of natural right. He'd learned about from Strauss, and then Jaffa became increasingly interested in the way in which the Americans understood natural right in a way that was compatible with all of the basic requirements of civilization that people like Russell Kirk were interested in supporting and preserving. So, for example, take the gay rights question of the 1980s. Jaffa, very emphatically saw the connection between the natural rights teaching of the founders and the idea of heterosexual marriage, a theme that admirers of Kirk, of course, would have agreed with, but which for a long time people had thought for a long time that if you believe in natural rights, you basically have to believe in gay rights. Today, right now, there's one of my favorite debating partners, Peter Lawler, writes article after article in all the most respectable conservative publications, saying if you believe in the founders' view of natural right, you're going to believe in gay marriage, bottom line. Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame has the same view. This is a view that's out there everywhere. And Jaffa's point is you can't have a foundation for a true conservatism unless you can show that there's something in human nature itself that supports it. Now, you could have Christianity, but of course that turns out right now in our time to be not an adequate basis on which to appeal, because there are too few Christians around, and nobody's going to listen to you unless they are a Christian. So I think that was the important thing for Jaffa. Try to get conservatism to once again understand they have a foundation in the American political tradition, and they don't need to be going down the road that Russell Kirk taught of abandoning abstract principle. In fact, abstract principle is our friend as conservatives in Jaffa's argument.
This is a question for all of you. You've all kind of fleshed out in different ways the distinctions made between Strauss and where Jaffa kind of makes his own way. Given that Mansfield, Bloom, several other Straussians have very, very, very different political philosophies in general, how accurate would you say today, given kind of where Jaffa has emerged in his own right, would you even say that it's correct to put these different camps within the same general vicinity, or would it be more accurate, especially since all of you, maybe Dr. Grant excluded, studied specifically under Jaffa? Can you even lump those together today?
I'll be happy to say something.
Which camps, Andy?
Yeah.
Strauss, generally.
The different Straussians today, you mean? Like the...
Would you even consider Jaffa Straussian compared to, say, Bloom or Mansfield or some of the other?
I'll just say Jaffa's claim was that, they're all of their claims are the same, right? We're the ones who follow Strauss. That's what the argument's about. And the argument is deep in some cases and less deep in others, but it's a big argument and it's important, and it has to do with what Strauss meant. And you want to say something about that, Tom?
Yeah, from Jaffa's point of view, look, Jaffa was a great admirer of Strauss, and he thought of himself as somehow following in Strauss's, fulfilling Strauss's legacy. But really, for a guy like Jaffa, the more important thing is not Strauss. That's just a guy. He's a guy who pointed to something beyond Strauss. What Jaffa learned from Strauss was that the idea of political philosophy, the idea of natural right, the idea that in spite of the fact that for the last 150 years we've been told again and again that science is incompatible with value judgments, or later we've been told again and again that the historical process has made it impossible for there to be any standards that transcend one's own time. Strauss had persuaded Jaffa that there can be objective transcendent standards. And so for Jaffa, that was the big question, to pursue that. What would that mean in our time? What would that look like to say, let's say, that the founders were right about natural right? And Jaffa tried to explain what that was. And what I was saying in my talk was, when Jaffa started out in the 50s, he didn't yet understand that the founding was actually a noble thing. He thought it was this bad thing. He had learned from those very superficial comments Strauss makes about Locke, that the founding is low. And Jaffa didn't get yet that was an insufficient understanding of Locke and of the founding. And Jaffa had to discover that on his own. He didn't learn that from Strauss. Strauss is just a name, a label here. Come on, we're talking about what's true, what's going to be the right guide for America in the future. Strauss can point us towards some important arguments, but he's not an authority. Shouldn't be.
The one other thing I would add to that is, I've had so many different political and religious positions ascribed to me because I am a Straussian. It's amazing how diverse these are, mutually exclusive in many cases. I do think that one thing that Straussians still, now so many generations down and, so diverse, that they still have in common is a certain approach to reading texts. I think it's important for education. I think that would be that's the one thing I would add would be a common thread.
Okay, this will be our final question.
Can I add to that Professor Jaffa was very aware of his own virtues and not shy about talking about them. But it's also true that he agreed with Tom. He didn't think the issue was Strauss or Jaffa. He thought there were issues, and we were supposed to be studying them. A sign of that, although, as I say, he was ready to talk about his own virtues, was that I never heard him speak of Strauss or of his wife or of Churchill or of Lincoln or of George Washington with anything except reverence and humility. And that means that the student's question is not a question about a person, finally. It's about things to know. And we like our teachers if they help us with those questions.
Hi. It seemed like, and I think Dr. West addressed this most directly in his comments, but in defending the American founding, Jaffa saw the need to, in some way, cut off the founders from the modern political project and cut them off from Locke's lineage in Machiavelli and Hobbes. And I'm wondering how, in effect, is that accomplished? Is that a John Locke who writes as a much more classical thinker, or is it the founders who take Locke's ideas in a much different direction than even Locke himself would say? Where is the break from the Prince?
Do you mean for Jaffa or for?
I think for Jaffa, but if we're trying to sever the American founding from this obviously malign influence, where does that come?
I think Jaffa's approach was to try and study the American founding on its own term and not as an epiphenomenon of Enlightenment thought, which is actually proper. It's not. When I was talking about the importance of historical context, that's part of that. Understand what did the founders think they were doing, not what ideas were snuck in like a plague bacillus through phrases used by Locke or Hobbes or what have you. I think that's what Jaffa did. I'd also think Jaffa wasn't very good on the early moderns. I'll commit another heresy here. I mean, he was great on a lot of topics. I don't think he deeply studied Hobbes or Locke, for instance. I don't know of any evidence of that. Maybe you would jump in, but.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I would say that, I repeat the point I made at the beginning, that most of the Straussians thought they had learned from Strauss that there was something defective about Locke, and therefore about the founding insofar as it was Lockean, and that led them all to try to find some non-Lockean influence so that we didn't have to think ill of America. That's what Jaffa's original view of Lincoln was. He was the guy that saved America from the degradation of Jeffersonian principles, ultimately Lockean. And I held that view myself up until the 90s. I mean, I had the same view. But there's two remedies to that, I think. One is, first step is exactly what John said. The only way to understand what the founders were about is to look at the founders. And in their context, that is, which means to say you can't just look at the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist, and the Constitution. You got to look at the state constitutions. You got to look at documents published by public bodies. There's a massive historical record that scholars tend to neglect in the founding that gives you a much fuller picture of the richness of their understanding of policy, morality, and constitutionalism than you're going to get from just a quick reading of the Declaration. So that's on the one. And the other side, you do have to go back to Locke and see whether, in fact, the superficial Straussian view of Locke is true. Turns out it's not true. One of the most easy things to prove is that Locke's all about morality in politics. Whereas the common view of Locke is Locke doesn't think there's any place for morality in politics. I mean, all you have to do is look at the letter on toleration. Somehow, I remember an early Straussian, Robert Goldwyn. You know, I was making this point at a conference, and he says, tell me one passage in Locke where Locke says morality should be present in politics. I said, well, how about the letter on toleration, where Locke says that, that there should be no toleration of moral doctrines that undermine the preservation of society. And Goldwyn sat down quietly and had nothing to say. Because he didn't know about that. He had never remembered that passage, because he had absorbed this idea from Strauss that, oh, well, Locke's anti-morality. Now, Strauss didn't ever actually say that. Strauss's actual view of Locke was very sophisticated. But it wasn't, he didn't, you know, his students had absorbed this rather superficial understanding, which just wasn't true. So I'm saying you can either go back to Locke or go back to the founding. Either one, you're going to end up understanding. These guys have a much more adequate and rich understanding of the political than you would get from listening to most Straussians today or by a superficial reading of Natural Right and History by Strauss.
All right, please join me in thanking the panelists.